They say when you wear Black Power Media gear, you can accomplish anything. You can play any and every position. From coaching, to kicking, to receiving, to running and juking. And, oh my goodness, let's see that again in slow motion. Get off me. And you're going to have a lot of haters coming at you, but what you got to do is you got to shake them off, and get to your goal and accomplish it. And when that's done, it's a beautiful thing. I'm talking about going hard, extra, for that extra point. And when it's done beautifully, you talking about touchdown. Oh, and the crowd goes wild and they're celebrating with you and everything. Man, let's see that again. Nice.
Black Power Media, baby. That's how we do it.
Now go to blackpowermedia.org and get you some of that gear. Empower yourself today. Yeah.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. All right, what's up, world? Welcome to another edition of I Mix What I Like right here at Black Power Media. Again, I'm Jared Ball, very happy to be your host. And joining us once again, is my main man, Dr. Kwasi Konadu, of many other things, among many other things, professor of history and Africana studies, and I'm sure you can correct that exact title, at Colgate University. No, not at Colgate anymore. Are you at Colgate still? My bad.
I am.
You are? Okay, my bad. I'm all right. I thought, yeah, anyway. But also the founder and head of very importantly Diasporic Africa Press, and to a lesser extent one of my predecessors at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell University under the directorship of its founding director, Dr. James Turner. So always good to see you, my man. Good to have you back with us. Please correct any of that you need to, and I apologize for any of the errors there, but it's always good to see you. Welcome back.
Appreciate it very much. No error at all. We're good.
So starting with that end part there, we haven't had a chance to have you on publicly since he passed and made his transition, but Dr. James Turner was again instrumental in both of our developments. And as I said, you preceded me to the Africana Studies and Research Center. And as I always like to remember, people somewhat derisively even joked about how you and then later me were had sort of made these attempts to be Turner Cubs and as if it was some sort of negative. And I remember somebody saying that to me before I really knew you, and I thought that's more of an encouragement for me to get to know you. Like, I don't know, like, and to walk away from this, this guy, you know what I mean? It's like,
Right.
But anyway, so I did want to, I know you were close with Dr. Turner and you remain close with his family, and wanted to give you a chance to just say a few words or anything that you would like to about him. And then we'll get into today's conversation.
Sure thing. Well, I'm not sure you remember this, Jared, but we actually met when my last semester there at the Africana Center. So I was simply sort of offboarding and you were onboarding.
Okay, right.
We came for a visit. And you might remember this. At that point, I didn't have a ride or a car, but you did. And you drove me or us in town. Again, this is a different Ithaca, of course. And we went to a spot to get something to eat. And along the way, we were talking. Yeah, we went down that sort of narrow, road down the hill. Is when you get off the main campus, right, where all the bars are. That strip, and then of course you head down. There's an Indian food spot, and then around the corner, which makes your way down to downtown Ithaca itself. So you and I were driving around in your car, and we were chopping it up. So that was our first real.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I remember.
Sorry, man. That's terrible. Yeah. My memory's a mess. But yeah, no, that's
cool. At least one of us. You got to have one half at least.
Somebody got to remember. Yeah, thank you.
But it was immediate because what connected us was not simply that moment, but of course our adoration and respect for Turner as a person, but also as someone who. In a Tuskegee-like fashion, in a Booker T-like fashion, built institution, brick by brick. And I think we both understood that, if not immediately, soon thereafter. And so when Turner transitioned, one of the moments which hit me was one of the features of his life which really hit me hard. Wasn't his transition per se. It was that I felt as if I had this strong personal connection to Turner, and thousands of people felt the same way.
Yeah.
And so what to me is one of the remarkable features of Turner in spirit and in this lifetime was that I don't know how he did it, but he made thousands of people, students, family, otherwise, feel as if Turner was theirs. And I don't know what capacity he had to make everyone feel that way. And at the same time, not giving an inch in terms of deprivation to his own children, biological children. And I thought to me, that's one of his most remarkable feats is that, sort of unlimited capacity to be there for others, to, have this intellectual and of course, unconditional sort of African love, meaning sort of this sort of village-like, extended village-like love and affection, and to do so much for so many people from one person.
Right on. Yeah. No, that was something that I always remember being in the room. I always think about this for it's actually happened a number of times. People at retirement speeches, they confess not having spent enough time with their children and grandchildren and things like that. And it's always struck me that that's unfortunate, even as they've provided a lot of great work in other areas of life. But Turner seemed to have bridged that gap, because it seemed to be unanimous among his children, grandchildren, other family. Like nobody seemed to be like, I didn't get enough, or I didn't, I don't know. I mean, it's remarkable. So yeah, on many fronts, he set a standard for us. So yeah. Somewhat unfortunately, the struggle in which he was engaged and passed on has crept up yet again. So even as we start to talk about today's topic and the new history wars, and I'll let you lay it out. I'll having read the relevant pieces for today. I mean, the first thought I had was, that Turner was connected to that break, I believe in 1968, where the African Heritage Studies Association with Dr. Clark and others says, look, we need to leave the African Studies Association. And a name that popped up again in this for today, you know, Philip Curtin and others, the white dominance over African studies was like, you know, needed to be broken away from. And then here it comes again.
Mm-hmm.
So you sent me this piece. You said you would ask if I had been following it, and if we, you know, and then I'm thankful you offered to talk about it, because I had not seen it, was not following it, but am fascinated by it, and unfortunately not surprised. So let me stop there and let you take a first crack at explaining for us, setting the context. And if you like, I can pull up the article. We can go through it. It's you know.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's there again. And of course, again, Turner was at the forefront, as Dr. Clark called James Turner his lieutenant.
Yeah.
And of course, it's fitting because you know, the notion of history wars, whether it's a new history wars or old history wars, the notion of war is apropos, as it was in 1969 in Montreal, when as you know, some of the folks will check this out later. This was really a seismic moment in the fight, continuing fight over not just storytelling, but the power and the resources that are implied by studying a continent of almost 2 billion people, right? And their historic diasporas, which number, of course, in the hundreds of millions outside of the motherland. And so there's a lot of, as people like Melville Herskovits recognized quite early on, there's a lot of power and a lot of money involved in who controls expertise regarding the study of Africa, right? A lot of dough. And a lot of political power is involved. And so not surprising that Herskovits, he's the founding director of the African Studies Association, this white organization that was founded to be the premier Africanist organization in the United States, would find itself in '69 confronted by what they claim to be activists,
Yeah,
not intellectuals, but activists, you know, who were trying to essentially derail, if not destroy, the very existence of the ASA, which of course is a colonial enterprise, right?
Yeah, I'm going to ask you about that. If you want to get into that now, I'm happy for you to. But I do have as one of my points for us to address is
so we can circle back to this. We can circle back to this. And so this new idea, this idea of the new history wars, what was ignited by a piece in the American Historical Association's newsletter, and the president, James Sweet, who is at Wisconsin in Madison. Every month, the president of the association, writes, the AHA writes a sort of a bit of a note to the membership, right? So this is sort of in-house, and then that particular note circulated on Twitter, and Twitter is its own sort of non-universe, because Twitter, you know, is not a real place, but people think it's more real than reality.
Don't you say that Twitter's not real,
right? Right. So in this non-universe, where apparently everything happens, by which I'm not on, and so Twitter went after him about what he laid out as essentially a similar argument that white folks in the ASA had laid out, to say that the white folks in the ASA in '69 had argued that we are detached, observant, objective scholars, and you all, meaning African folks, are just activists, who want to use history for political ends, right? And so Sweet sort of makes a similar argument here that when he picks on he's in Ghana for a few months, and he sees these people of African ancestry there from the U.S. Who are going through the slave castles or dungeons that line that coast. And I just happened to be in Ghana at the same time, not around him. I didn't see him, but I was further up north in Ghana. And so he talks about this experience as these people who are visitors of African ancestry, they have a certain sort of historical framing or perspective on those castles. But the government of Ghana also framed that experience by essentially offering a sort of touristic version, right, rather than the real history, right? He goes after the Woman King, right, about the warriors in Dahomey during the reign of King or ruler Gezo. And I've been to Dahomey, by the way. I've been to Palace in Abomi, so I can talk about all that too in terms of what's on the ground. And he talks about obviously the 1969 project, right? Which of course I'm sure you and other folks have diced up for good reason.
Or the 1619, yeah.
69, thank you. 1619 project, appreciate it. Yeah. New York Times project. So he goes after these particular features of the historical landscape, and I think he makes some relatively decent points. But of course, the blowback is not about the points, about how rational the points are. The blowback is about this is coming from a white man who is obviously privileged as being the head of the American Historical Association, and his positionality, right? His subjectiveness doesn't allow him to see the harm that he's created by pointing out these matters of historicity, right? These matters of what is factual and what is political volley. What is a dog whistle in terms of using certain kinds of information to further political ends, whether it be historical in this case or otherwise. And so that set off a whole firestorm on Twitter. That set off whole kinds of reaction in the print media, the mainstream print media, whether it's The Nation or other kinds of publications. That set off tons of people calling for a resignation. That set off, even people. I think on HBO, there's a guy, Bill Maher.
Bill Maher. He got involved with this. Oh, Lord.
Yep. He was talking about the history wars. The Atlantic has a piece on the history wars. So this stuff has taken on a life of its own. So I figured it might be, I think, important for folks to dig into this because, what's really at stake is really sort of the food or the fodder that we use for those of us in the academy for instruction or in K through 12. Has implications for obviously for protracted struggle, right? In terms of what kinds of information informs strategy and tactics. It has all kinds of implications for organizations and movements. It has all kinds of struggles. Emphasis for the ongoing fight against empire and imperialism. If we can get the stories right, right? And so there's a lot here that's implied. Plus, of course, the popular culture. So movies like The Lion King, not The Lion King, The Woman King, excuse me. These are the kinds of things, where to what extent does these reenactments of a certain kind of histories, do they need to be accurate? Do they need to, fall into or fill a sort of political void or political messaging in a moment far away from when the action occurred? To what extent, who can speak, right? I just wrote a book about triple biography about three women in the 16th century, again, far removed 20th century, but their stories about European empire, at the dawn of European empire. Their stories about pushback against religious slaving and, religious colonialism. Their stories is about this idea of sort of female power, at this dawn when most of European imperial intrusion is headed by males, right? And so, do I qualify? Can I write a history about Black women, right? About African women? So all these things are sort of boiled up into this particular moment where we have I think quite a bit to untangle to sort of see our way out of it because of what's at stake.
So let me just say this, because you said something already that I just need to clarify for those who are not maybe clear. We're not live, so I should have made that clear initially. This is a pre-recorded discussion. But I will happily comb through the comments and that I'll encourage people to leave for us so that we can respond to them and have you back when you come back to talk about this book that you've just apparently, you publish a lot, so I have to, I'm behind on a lot, but so we have to have you come back to talk about that work, and then maybe we can respond to some of the questions that people will have for this episode. So go ahead and continue to
put it in the comments.
And we'll respond. And if you need to, you can let us know.
It's wrong, bro.
And we'll try to, all right. So that's one thing. So definitely, let's put a pin in that and come back to you coming back on to talk about that work. I just don't want to get sidetracked. I'm already fascinated. I'm like, damn, we can go down anyway. So I don't want to, and I need to read it and get it and all that stuff. So, all right. The other thing is, I just wanted, if we can, I want to pull this back up and just share a little bit so we can, because to deal with this and then get to actually the main article that you sent, which raises many of these other issues as well. But just a couple things, and if there's others from here that you want us to address, let me know. But just so that people are a little bit clear about what Sweet is saying here. And again, as the head of the African Studies Association.
My apologies. He's the head of the American Historical Association.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Right. Sorry. Thank you for that. But he says here, 20 years ago in these pages, Lynn Hunt argued against presentism. She lamented historians' declining interest in topics prior to the 20th century, as well as our increasing tendency to interpret the past through the lens of the present. So first of all, in general, just broadly, without context, I love that academics would be raising this as a concern. I love that. I think that's great. Outside of this present context, I think that this is a great question. I would have never even thought to recognize this as an issue in terms of the amount of people focusing on, their work on history before the 20th century. I think all of that is, I think, a great, but and correct me if I'm wrong, but where Sweet and she previously went into is that the problem that they have really is that, as you were pointing out with the ASA and the HSA break, is that the critique of the absence of context applied to these questions is being seen as not academic, not historian, activist only, somehow lesser intellectual, and therefore, so in other words, what Sweet starts saying is whether it's the 1619 Project or other work, are historians bringing too much of a contemporary lens to the past. And then trying to sort of wokeify their critique is really what I think he's saying.
Yes.
So, by the way, there was one other thing. Just this line here bothered me when he said, when he says here, when I first read the newspaper series that preceded the book, I thought about the 1619 Project. He said it was a synthesis of a tradition of Black nationalist historiography dating to the 19th century with Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent call for reparations. So I was like, again, there's like an absence of even an understanding of the breadth of Black and African politics. Unless I'm misinterpreting what he's saying here, to put Ta-Nehisi Coates in the context or the lineage of Black nationalist historiography is I think inaccurate and unfair, but just, so in other words, but anyway, so that's, in short, that's what I think he's saying. And I'll make sure the links to all of this are there. People can read about them, read more carefully on their own. Now, where I did find myself in agreement, and that, is because obviously I had a problem with the Woman King myself, but maybe from a different political or nuanced perspective, but his concern with as he says here, historically accurate rendering of Asante or Dahomean greed and enslavement apparently contradict modern day political imperatives. What he's really doing is, despite his apology that he then posted at the top of this article, he's really taken a Republican, conservative, white supremacist, anti-Black, attack on liberalism, attack on wokeness, to, with this whole thing of modern day political imperatives, as if there's something wrong with people wanting to correct what has been traditionally just a white male imperial context or narrative that goes unquestioned. And then I'll stop here by saying, it's similar to what I'm seeing happen in a lot of the critique about the, for instance, the Marvel and DC comic book universe, with Black people showing up more, with queer folks showing up more, and all these white men are saying, why are we changing everything? Why we got to put politics in everything? And leaving out the fact, as I'm sure Bill Maher did, that up until this point, the problem has only been that it's only white male views and white male politics and Western dominant and Eurocentric views that get heard, and that's supposed to go unquestioned. But as soon as people start to question that, then all of a sudden is, oh, we're being presentist, or we're being activist, as opposed to the idea that as if as I'd invite you to talk about now, even the ASA wasn't itself a political enterprise, as if the historiography or historical history as a field isn't itself a political. So anyway, I just wanted to give some of that so people will have some of an idea, and then they can of course read beyond and for themselves, and then you are invited to say anything in response to that you like. But so anyway, that's I just want to put some of that, and then maybe it is good now for a good time for you to now talk a little bit about the origins of the ASA and the context of which that original narrative that's supposed to go forever unquestioned was developed.
Sure thing. So it is certainly important for context. For those who will check this out a little bit later, that excuse me. The ASA, the African Studies Association of the United States, because there's a UK version as well. The ASA within the confines of the United States was founded by Melvin Herskovits and others. And Melvin Herskovits was a professor, a white Jewish professor at Northwestern University. Herskovits had spent some time graduate study. He studied under Franz Boas, cultural anthropology, at Columbia, right? And so, far as I'm aware, Herskovits only studied the year of Hausa in terms of African languages, but knew no other African language. Herskovits, he and his wife will later go on to spend a few weeks in Haiti, ironically in Dahomey, in the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, in Nigeria, in Suriname, in Trinidad, and we'll collect a lot of footage, both visual and auditory recordings, and essentially an archive. And that's essentially how Herskovits built himself up as the expert, as it was framed in the 1950s and 60s on African affairs, right? And that gave him, inroads into the State Department. In fact, he worked for the State Department, right? And we should not forget that African Studies comes out of the State Department. This was a national security mechanism that took shape on academic universities and funded by many of the funders of Black Studies, such as the Ford Foundation, right?
Yeah, and wasn't it also connected to a response to the Soviet Union launching Sputnik and feel like they needed to compete, the Cold War and all that? We need to study Africa so that we can take over and keep the Russians out, all that kind of stuff. Anyway.
All the above. So Cold War politics, it is also a pushback against these decolonial, anti-colonial movements in Africa and the Caribbean, right, in the 50s and 60s. And so this is sort of the broader setting in which the ASA is founded, right, as a political, intellectual, and organizational front, because what's at stake is that in these new independent African nations, there is the quest for what was then called a usable pass. So now countries, for example, are not choosing to name themselves Liberia. They're choosing to name themselves Mali. Upper Volta becomes Burkina Faso. The Gold Coast becomes Ghana, which is a title from the ruler of the ancient empire of Ouagadougou, right? Again, Mali from the ancient empire of Mali. In other words, these Africans are, excuse me, these are a new kind of Africans, right? Sort of playing on the notion of Elaine Locke, the new Negro. These are new kind of Africans, and they're using history, their histories and their past, frame themselves in a way that connects them to a longer trajectory, right? A longer historical continuity. And so in naming these countries, the name that they choose, right, it signals that these are not countries and architects that are coming out choosing to be part of France or choosing to be part of Britain, right? These are folks who are saying that we want a new kind of African. And to do that, a lot of the folks in place I study, which is the Gold Coast, Ghana, people like J.B. Danquah and others, they look to history. And in fact, J.B. Danquah was the one who proposed Ghana as a name for the country, right? And so history becomes very usable and useful, as most people do. You know, they look to you know, in terms of their own imagination and their own historical experiences, they look to that to tap that well in terms of how they're going to frame themselves as new kinds of people on the world stage. So that's happening across the continent. And the ASA and Herskovits, they see this as a moment to essentially get in on the ground floor, right? To get in on the ground floor to, if not tailor, if not side with these many independent leaders. And so there have tons of photos of Herskovits with African nationalist leaders, right? Trying to side with them as if he's an ally. But what he's after is about the interpretation or the expertise, because this is how African studies works then and now. Most of the experts are non-Africans. Most of the books published are not published by African publishers or publishing houses. Tenure, promotion, and all of the features of the academy are solely within the United States and Europe. And so this is what was at stake. And so in '69, when there was a meeting in Montreal of the African Studies Association, a number of intellectuals, including John Henry Clark, James Turner, and a host of others, they got into another room and said, you know, they basically bum rushed the mic, and there's footage of this.
And
said,
we all have experienced a version of this. Like all of us have been in spaces where they have the Black Caucus and the brown or the people of color, the colored room. And you find yourselves, I've been in so many of these rooms where you packed wall to wall, like these big conference spaces, and it's all of a sudden it's packed wall to wall with the colored folks who have to squeeze into one room.
Right.
And it's like
it's like one plenary, right? Yes. It's a caucus of just
and
the,
all
you know,
of you in there.
Right. The
Anyway,
people of color caucus, right?
Yeah.
So these folks said, look, they bum rushed the mic and said, look, we're not going to essentially take this anymore. This sort of colonialization of knowledge about our folks in the elongated sense, about the histories of our folks, and about essentially the sort of revolutionary potential, because this is happening in '69. Nkrumah was overthrown in '66, right? Lumumba was just assassinated, you know, a few years earlier. You know, and so a lot of turmoil in terms of the revolutionary potential that's bubbling on the continent is at stake. And these folks, you know, people of African ancestry, you know, who are in Montreal at this meeting, they are very clear about not about all this stuff is political, right? And they're very clear. So they pull back that veil and say, hey, you white folks at the ASA are not doing anything that is unpolitical, right? All this stuff is political, especially Herskovits and others, and many of them in the ASA, because many of them, they worked with the State Department, they worked with other government agencies, USAID, they worked with the foundations, right? They worked with these suppliers of arms and weaponry. They worked with the CIA, and so all these people are very much implicated in a very deep way with the U.S. empire and with the politics of that empire, right? And so when these folks push back, they not only, you know, make their claims, they then go and organizationally form the African Heritage Studies Association, right? The AHSA, and that's headed by James Turner, and Dr. Clark, and others who rally behind. That story of the AHSA, of course, is a different matter that we can pick up some other time in terms of what happens to it in the years after. But in that first decade at '69, it was a vibrant outlet for people to pursue Africa in the way that they saw fit, as people that have a direct ancestral stake, and of course other kinds of stakes, you know, in the study of Africa, because they realized, like Herskovits did, that a lot of political power, a lot of money, and a lot of how the world is going to pivot in terms of valuable resources, in terms of land, in terms of all the things we see happening now with India, China, and Europe carving up the continent yet again. They saw all this stuff at stake as well. And so this is that pivotal moment that sort of dovetails or mirrors what's happening now, because some of the claims that Sweets make as you unmask, they're eerily familiar with the claims that the white leadership of the ASA made, right? That essentially pinning folks to some Black nationalist tradition, right? Which is a dirty word, by the way, for those who are checking this out. To be a painted Black nationalist is to be a dashiki wearing, a so-called militant who is out of touch and has some fantasy of some idea of a Black nation, right? And so to be called a Black nationalist is a dirty word. It's like a boogeyman in and outside of the academy. And so pinning Coates to that is part of that particular way of essentially saying that, those people are into something else other than real history or real scholarship, right? When we are trying to preserve the historical profession in its organic and sort of unfettered form, right? Which of course is hypocrisy, because the AHA, the American Historical Association, was founded by people like Woodrow Wilson, Birth of a Nation. Right?
But the whole point is it's an explicitly political project so that the state can study Africa for the purposes of colonization, of imperial intervention, of resource allocation, and conquering. So I mean, and I've made this point before, but I just like to from time to time remind folks that the academic world produces a tremendous amount of really good deep diving research into all corners of the world. The main problem that I have with that, of course, is that a lot of it is with this bias of Western imperialism and used for that purpose. So while we all may not be reading all of these scholarly journals and books, et cetera, and so forth, the state is, or is getting redacted versions that are used and turned into policy and used to support policy. So there is this direct connection. I just got an email the other day inviting me and other faculty to participate in developing projects for the NSA. So, I mean, there's overt invitations to this. So now we in this audience may not produce or read that work or engage that work or whatever, but they are. So it's like, it's just something. So for him to that is sweet to write what he's written, suggesting that, again, as you pointed out, that only we do this only we bring biases and politics into history and our historiography, and bring this presentism, is just, it's intellectually dishonest. So, and then for him to write this apology where he's kind of saying it's almost like a form. It's like a form letter almost. Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't mean to offend my colleagues. I was just raising a question. I didn't even realize that this would make such a big impact. I was just writing a little statement. I was just reflecting. I mean, and to act like, my man, you speak these languages. Like, he's actually apparently sweet. When I was reading about him, he's apparently studied, Portuguese, but also African languages. Like he's apparently like really gone into the act. So it's like, you no longer have the excuse of ignorance. You're either embarrassingly naive, or you're making a conscious choice politically about your approach on this. So anyway, anyway, just want to throw that in there a little bit. I do want to, if we can, pull up the actual the Atlantic piece that you sent that is terming this, by David Frum, and I think you know more about him than I do. Certainly, maybe you could say a word about Frum himself, but this idea that there's a new history war. I'm sorry. Yeah,
he's a journalist. He's not a historian. He's a journalist.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, but as he says here, inside the strife set off by an essay from the president of the American Historical Association. and of course talking about the piece we just went through. I do like this graphic here. I'll give them credit. I do like that. I think that's appropriate for how people need to interpret history and its role. But anyway, I'll just read this initial statement here, the paragraph here. Even by the rancorous standards of the Academy, the August eruption of the at the American Historical Association was nasty and personal. The August edition of the association's monthly magazine featured, as usual, a short essay by the association's president, James H. Sweet, a professor at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Within hours of its publication, an outrage volcano erupted on social media. A professor at Cornell vented about the author's white gaze. A historian at the University of San Diego denounced the essay as significant and substantial violence. A historian at Knox College in Illinois organized an email campaign to pressure the AHA to respond. Mm-hmm. So we've already gone through a little bit about what that essay said. But I do think it's interesting to note that, of course, the Wall Street Journal and Fox News have all come out to condemn the woke mob and to defend Sweet's right to this, that, and the third. By the way, it's not all that, and I think by the time this comes out, our platform will have addressed this more fully. But our own comrade, Dr. Sundiata Chajiwa, is, as we are taping today on November 8th, going through a similar Breitbart inspired attack on him. For a column he wrote recently in which he referred to Herschel Walker as coonish. Mm-hmm. So now Breitbart and the right white, who are, of course, historically known for their great concern about the anti-Black imaging and commentary that exists in this world, have come out to condemn our comrade, encouraging that the university, review his status and so on and so forth. I was, it's a bad joke, but I was thinking, like, so you want another Black man to get fired and to have to live off the welfare state for you to complain about that then too, right? It's like, it's like, damn. It's like, but this idea that first of all, that again, academic or intellectual production is political, and that there is always this attempt, especially among the right, to condemn people and then have them fired and removed. Despite what is supposed to be this, as they also condemn this liberal academic environment. So anyway, I'll raise at least my first highlighted point here, and then I'll turn it back over to you. But where Frum writes, should we study the more distant past to explore its strangeness and thereby jolt ourselves out of easy assumptions that the world we know is the only possible one? Or should we study the more recent past to understand how our world came into being and thereby learn some lessons in shaping the future? In other words, as Sweet and others are concerned, what is history and how will it be used, and so on and so forth. So anyway, there's a lot more to get into with this essay, but let me at least just stop here and bring you back in.
Sure thing. So there's a premise there, at least in the last question, right? Which you highlighted, and the premise there is that history provides lessons, and I think that's a faulty premise. History doesn't provide lessons. History is like a wet bar of soap in prison. It's solid, but it's hard to get a handle on. And of course, that's a joke, a prison joke, which of course is dangerous, depending upon who has the bar of soap and who doesn't. And so, his history is a tool that can be used any which way. The same hammer that can destroy a house, the same hammer that can build a house. So history is really this neutral force that can be shaped in any direction. And that's what you see happening in terms of the so-called history wars, is folks shaping it, the way in which they see fit. Now, there are two arguments here. One is that, well, shouldn't folks, have the ability, if not the right, to shape history as they see fit, right, to fit their reality, to fit their moment, and that's a valid argument. And the other argument is that, well, if that's the case, then really anything can be historicized, right? Anything can be historical, and therefore history loses meaning as being something very discrete and different, right? If it can be anything, if it can morph into anything, then it loses its distinctive feature, and therefore it stops being history anymore, right? It becomes journalism, which is always about the moment, right? So what I think from both arguments we need to do is sort of step back and say, well, there's professional history, right? Meaning that are done by professional historians, just like they're professional writers, people who do this, for a living. There's a certain method involved. There's a certain craft. And Jared, you can appreciate this because you are obviously a former history major and historian in your own right? And so, okay. Right. So I'm saying there's a professional, degree to which this can be a full-time occupation. This can be a guild. And that's why you have associations like the American Historical Association. It's professional historians, what they do for a living. Then you have, folks who are not professional, who are not part of that guild, but still can do, the serious kind of work and research. So, for example, you can read the work of a Paul Robeson, who was not a professional historian, right? But what they produce, does capture historical moments, particularly from someone who was a participant in it, right? Who was a major participant in it. Or you can read works by, whether it's folks in the Black Panther Party, or you read folks from other kinds of, so-called activist background and tradition that are in many cases more informed than any academic could be, right? And so my takeaway here is that A, history doesn't provide lessons, right? B, history can be used in whichever way people see fit, because history is about human action, and whatever residue that human action produces, it can be molded and made to fit a moment. Now, what's interesting here is that in the Sweets piece, and certainly the analysis by David Frum, is that what's not being talked about is how history has been weaponized against people of African ancestry, right? That's not part of the discussion. That history, just like, for example, I was listening to a program last night. I was on a radio show, and the person before me was the ambassador of Cuba, and they're talking about the embargo and the ways in which people weaponize food or weaponize medical supplies, right? And likewise, folks have weaponized history to make African peoples not exist in history, whether it's from Hegel onward, right? The African people are devoid of history. They don't exist in historical time. They're in some other parallel universe, right? And therefore, they are made to be the recipients of what people are now calling, anti-African, anti-Black violence, and so on. And so that, I think, is the other layer to this, is that now people in the historical who are professional historians, they're now essentially crying wolf about history being used in the way that they have prescribed. But when history has been weaponized against the so-called the rest, the people that are supposed to be without history, then it becomes a problem, right?
So to your point, I'm sorry, go ahead. No, I don't mean to cut you off, but go ahead.
Good.
But to your point, I mean, I thought this was what so from, I think from a certain, relatively speaking, does a good job in this article, in terms of laying out the arguments, trying to cover both sides, et cetera, and so forth. But the crucial failing, if I'm catching what your point is and what I remember from this piece, is that it doesn't address the initial context of history being used as a weapon against African people. So then, as in a very almost slick way, as I'm highlighting here, they're able to, Frum, in addition, Sweet or whoever else, are able to come back with this whole thing of, well, as he says here, Sweet identified a problem. Very few people of the transported to what would become the United States passed through Elmina. So in other words, he goes through this whole thing about when Black people from the diaspora, particularly the United States, go back to Ghana and go through Elmina, they're creating a historical fantasy for themselves, almost a politicized historical fantasy to connect themselves to ancestors that probably didn't even go through this door. So it's kind of like, see, the problem is, with you activists is that, in trying to reclaim, it's like he skipped a step. But it's almost like to say, to reclaim the history we've stolen from you and used against you, you all are making a real mess of the situation here. And so we kind of need Sweet and others to remind you of this presentism problem and the wokeism problem, and and maybe not to judge history from today's work, from today's standards. Again, as if the whole construct we're dealing with wasn't done for that exact reason.
Indeed.
So anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so I'll jump right in there because what you touched on is deeply important. That statement is more or less, factually accurate. However, factual accuracy and being rational, that doesn't make it necessarily important. What's important here is not that folks, whether folks' ancestors came through Elmina. The reality here, and the point I think that's being missed is that it doesn't matter if they came through Elmina or not. The fact is they came through a kind of Elmina. So whether it was Luongo, or it was the Congo River, or it was by the Niger Delta River, or it was Senegal River, the Gambia River, they came through a port like that thing. For example, we can't visit all parts of Africa, at least not on my budget. But people who are going to Ghana, and this is where I'm coming to a bit of their defense, even though I have my own critiques in terms of how far they take it. But the defense I'm making is that coming to one site or one part of Africa to be able to touch that soil and to be able to make that connection, for which again the histories have weaponized them to not have a connection. So African peoples, I remember, walking around New York City, I think my undergraduate years, and you look around New York City as a microcosm of what I'm trying to get at here, what I'm poking at, which is that there's little Italy, little Russia, little China, but where's little Africa? My point is that, legislatively, in cultural norm, and in terms of the violence of being essentially dispossessed, right? Ensure that people of African ancestry were surgically severed and had little opportunity for reconnection to their homelands, wherever they may have been. And that has been systematic, right? That's a function of weaponizing history, right? Essentially socializing folks as coloreds, as Negroes, anything but. And when they choose to be African, violence comes upon them, right? And so that violence is removed from any other people, right? Other people are celebrated. Italian Americans celebrated. Chinese people can celebrate their heritage. Japanese people celebrate. Russians celebrate their heritage. But when it comes to African people, somehow they're engaging in some Black nationalist fantasy, right? So that's what I mean by, the weaponizing history, that it doesn't really matter beyond the factual accuracy if people's ancestors came through Elmina or not. They came through some port like Elmina, right? And they were never given the opportunity or the means or a visa or a passport or means of transport to make that connection on their own, as other people were given in the Americas. For example, Indian people that came over, places like Trinidad and Jamaica and Guyana, they were given the passage of going back to their homeland and paid for by the British colonialist government. Chinese laborers who were called coolies, that's how we get the term in the Caribbean. They were giving, passage to and opportunity to go back home from. Africans were never afforded that particular passport or visa, right? So the ways in which, the violence of this European authored and scripted history has worked against African world connections is something that both pieces miss. And I think it's something that we have to, have to poke at, have to get at.
So I can't say that I know the brother or his work, but this is why I always insist on, whenever I'm given the opportunity, to refer to my time there at the Africana Studies and Research Center at Cornell, because though he's associated with the Africana Studies and Research Center in the Atlantic, Professor Mukoma wa Ngugi is only described as teaching at Cornell. So I don't know his exact situation. I don't know, but I do know he on his bio page it says the Africana Studies and Research Center and English department, I think. But let's be clear. No, I'm just playing. but his intervention here, I think, is interesting in terms of his being interviewed for this piece here. He was critical of Sweet's white gaze, and is quoted in here as saying, "It is no secret that African rulers were involved in the slave trade," because of course Sweet is bringing up this issue with the woman king, and again, we have a similar critique, but I think for different reasons, that is I and Sweet, on this issue, but Sweet is bringing up this thing of, oh, you made the woman king and you're glorifying people who enslaved other Africans, and you don't even focus on the African role and because that's not good for today's politics, or whatever he was saying. But as Ngugi writes or responds, "It is no secret that African rulers were involved in the slave trade. There is no revelation here. But it is more complex than that, because at the time they would not have seen themselves as Africans." An example of presentism, which I thought was that's bars. I think that's pretty good.
It is.
In fact, let me get this man his credit real quick.
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
So I like that point, especially in this context. So you all are saying this, and there you go with your imperialist presentism. Anyway, go ahead.
If I may jump in real quickly, I've written about this. I have a book called Transatlantic Africa, and it's about essentially stories told by the people who experienced transatlantic slaving or transoceanic slaving, right? And I made that point very clear in the second chapter about the identities of Negro, of African, and Black. These are what folks call interpolated identities, meaning these are trademarks, like Nike. These are trademarks that are hoisted upon these people, for whom, as a shorthand, we're referring to as people of African ancestry. But these are all trademarks, and they would have not seen themselves. They've seen themselves as either Bakongo, Yoruba, Akan, etc., right? And so on and so forth. That's definitely bars. But I take it a step further, that even professional history is about selective choices as well, because no one can tell the history of everything, everyone. First of all, you can't print that kind of book because it'd be too big. No one will read it. So history is about selection. And so when Sweet and others selects certain kinds of episodes to focus on as the fodder, right, as the food for their analysis, you see, the history of Dahomey or Asante does involve participating in slave trafficking, but the history of Dahomey also doesn't involve that. There's a period in Dahomey's history where they refuse to trade any of their men, because they needed men to fight their wars against Oyo, this Yoruba kingdom, and to defend whatever their conquests were. And so if the woman king chooses a slice when they are looking to go to palm oil production, right? That's a historical choice. That's what professional historians do. You see what I'm saying? And so if you flip it around,
and filmmakers
exactly, right,
they chose that point, and
exactly,
that was part of my critique. But yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Exactly. So, but what I'm saying is that the filmmakers and the directors, they made certain choices about what selections to take and what to emphasize, and that's what the professional historians do. But my point is that that's what professional historians do as well, because no one writes about everything and everyone at every time, right? They make selections, right? You write about Black buying power at a certain moment in time, right? And you take you through, because you can't write about it everything. And so we make selections. What inform those selections? Our own particular kinds of histories, our own backgrounds, our own likes and dislikes. And so to hoist the idea that, these selections somehow are only being made by, quasi-Black nationalist intellectuals and activists is not only dishonest, it's disingenuous, and it actually reflects in the same way, actually refracts in the same way that the folks who came through ASA essentially exposed the ASA for the ASA. Because right now, in that moment, I'm saying that present historians are being exposed because they do the same kind of selective choices.
Yeah.
They decide what to include, what stories not to include. They decide what analysis to make, what not to make, what to present. And all those choices are informed by their own politics.
And it goes, and it also, like, just another step farther, because something that I'm overly sensitive to is that it goes down to who they reference, who gets a plenary versus just a panel or not invited.
It's the expertise. So if you look at bibliographies of most academic history books, they're cited in the same kind of people, usually their buddies. And so, and I know this because I read footnotes in bibliographies.
Yep. And I do it out of spite. I'm petty. Like, where, like, I see people, you writing about a certain thing. Where am I at? Where are my people at?
Exactly.
Where am I,
Exactly.
Like,
right?
how you writing about this and I don't see X.
Exactly. Right. So it's sort of a game of intellectual tag, right?
Yeah.
And of course, that's its own politics because people live in their own little silos, right? Their own political, other, social silos. And so who you tag, who you reference, who you don't, is all a function of that politicized selective process, right? And whether people claim to be aware of it or not, it happened. And so it's not about whether people are explicitly conscious of it. They could or could not be, but that's irrelevant. What matters is the selection as it appears in print, as it appears in the blog, as it appears in the white papers, as it appears in the policy papers, right? As it appears in the museum. For example, historians, they made choices about the African American, History Museum in DC. Choices that I have big problems with because, but they're framed by certain politics.
Ooh, can we get one or two of those real quick? Do you have any off the top of your head that you would
Sure,
share?
I do. So there's a couple, black and white couple. They're at Boston University, John Thornton and Linda Haywood, and they were some of the major consultants for the early history of the kinds of artifacts and interpretation, right, on the placards when you go to that museum in DC. And so they're the consultants. So, for example, they use a term that was created by this white historian who passed away from University of Maryland. You probably know of him, Ira Berlin.
Oh yeah.
Had used this phrase from a linguist, by the way, who didn't give him credit, but he used this phrase called Atlantic Creoles, right? And the idea of Atlantic Creoles is that somehow groups of people from West Central Africa were predisposed to live a life as a captive person or enslaved person because they were already exposed to Portuguese Catholicism or Christianity. They already had, they were wearing European supplied dress and wear. They were exposed to European languages. They, had been acculturated into European norms before they left West Central Africa and came to the Americas. So they were already Creolized, right? And therefore, they were basically more well-suited for a life of enslavement than their unruly West African counterparts who had little of those encounters, right? That's sort of the gist of it. So Atlantic,
but there was no presentism in that bullshit.
Of course, that right. And so this is found in the interpretations on the placards at the museum.
Wow.
And it begins, and it's tied to the 1619 project because 1619, when those 20 odd Negroes were brought to what became the Jamestown colony, a number of them that came from Angola or West Central Africa in general. And so these were people who were speaking either Kimbundu or Kinkongo languages, and they were brought there from a Dutch slaver. And a number, and so, you know, people like Berlin and Haywood and Thornton, you know, they have essentially been writing about this so much, and they were key consultants. These are also people that have strong ties, you know, with an arch enemy of yours, and Skip Gates.
We already knew. So like you know what? Even without knowing it, I knew he was.
Of course. You know, Skip Gates, by the way, you know, he was involved in the selection of the person who directors of the Schomburg. You know, so I mean, so his tentacles run wild. So, but I wanted to give you some genealogy about these kinds of people, and how their politics bleed into the interpretation of these early histories, right? And how those histories then inform unsuspecting and largely uninformed or underinformed patrons who come to this large edifice called the African American Museum, right? Because this will probably be their first encounter, and there'll be no countervailing interpretation.
No, that's going to be it. This is it. It's like when they see a documentary or a movie. That's it. That's it. I saw Judas and the Black Messiah. I know about Fred Hampton. I saw Malcolm X. I know Malcolm. I saw, you know, 12 Years a Slave. I got slavery down pat. I'm good. Like it's a wrap. Like I know that that's how it works. So what you're saying is incredibly important. Let me just mute you for a second, because I think we're getting some feedback. But I want my praise of your point to go interrupted, because seriously, like I haven't even gone to see the museum. I'm in my own private personal protest boycott, because I know what it's there to do. Although what I'm thinking, especially since you're closer in the area, I think, man, we should maybe create a little, we should go down there, and I should tape you walking us through there until we get arrested or thrown out. Like, I think
I'm with it.
Put a little pin in that too.
I'm with it.
Because if I'm going to go, this is why I would want to go and have you, and then we can. So I'll follow up with you on that. Let's
and do something live, have folks come along.
Oh my God.
You know, so like FB Live, and have folks come along. So
we could stream to wherever from my phone. We can okay. Let's I'm already, we're going,
and you know what, I'm also down for this, because if it can be a fundraiser for BPM, then I see even gravy, you know.
Thank you, I love it. And again, as soon as we wrap here, we'll start the preparations. I think the planning. I think that's a great idea. That's a really good idea. Okay, thank you. But just coming back to this for at least a few more minutes, there's a couple other things. There's one other point from Professor Ngugi that I wanted to come back to here, that I thought was important. Because on the one hand, I'm mad that I feel like I know why he feels like he has to make this point in his previous essay on something similar, and why many of us feel compelled to make these kinds of points, but or are invited to make these kinds of points. But nonetheless, he says that, as it says here, Ngugi emphasized that he was not arguing for racial segregation of historical specialties. He wrote his own doctoral dissertation on the English Romantic poet John Clare. He admires the work of white Africanists such as Basil Davidson and Caroline Elkins. I don't know Elkins' work at all, but I do know Davidson, and I think he's as good as they could be. And I thought that he did a lot of great work, a lot of important work, a lot of pro-African history work. Anyway, his target is not white scholarship as such, but an ideology that assumes the continent and its people can and should be studied for the benefit of Western student and scholar, that knowledge is a commodity to be extracted from the continent to benefit the Western student and scholar, end quote. And that, I think, is a great point, one that I don't think Sweet addresses. I don't think in his apology or in his initial statement, and that seems to be absent from a lot of this at least inappropriate, it seems to me. And again, I'm not in these associations. I'm not, so I don't know, and maybe they're being discussed more than I'm giving credit, but the fact that it has come up yet again in this very popular way suggests to me that there is still this ongoing problem of people not recognizing, again, that initial politics that we've talked about here of the historical study of Africa and the context in which that historical study has been encouraged and funded and to this day supported. So I don't know if you had a particular response to that or additional, but I did want to at least bring that up. Let's see. There was a couple of, let's see. And then I'll just go through it. There were a few more things that I highlighted here. I don't know if he's talking about Sweet's background and, he starts to defend himself. Basically that whole thing of, I was cool with black people, it's like, I study poor people, black people, I'm, whatever. But he says he received almost 250 emails. A bunch was going on Twitter. Reflecting on the tumult, Sweet was most worried about a weakening commitment in the academy to this cherished ideal and methods of the historical profession. There is a move among some of my colleagues to expand the definition of scholarship, to change the way we assess scholarship. He told me, I worry there will be a move to de-emphasize the single author manuscript, the book. Instead, anything that uses the historian's craft or skills could count as scholarship. The most radical version might even include tweets or at least blogs or essays online. How do you determine then what is political, and what is scholarly? Now, to Frum's point, to Frum's credit, I'll say at least he does acknowledge that there has always been. I mean, he even asks in the very next line, I think, that there is. When has history writing not been, when has history writing been non-political? So to his credit, Frum at least responds, to that at least a little bit. But again, from Sweet's perspective or Sweet's statements, it's that same thing. What I do is not politicized. It's objective, honest history. What my critics are doing or advocating is something else. Anyway, it just seemed,
Right. And so there's a very important, point to be made, at least the observation to be made there. The observation is that that kind of sentiment, from the AHA president, is a sentiment where, if you read it carefully, of folks losing the ability to continually to weaponize history under the guise of some pure craft, right? Again, that's the same argument that ASA leadership made, white leadership made in '69 and before then. In fact, there are essays to which, for example, Turner and a colleague from I think East Africa had authored in the ASA organ or publication at the time. But the ASA had a series of essays, and one of them I remember clearly by one white male member, who talked about, ASA is essentially, it's called the ghettoization of African studies, right? That
I remember that phrase.
Yeah, I remember that, right?
Yeah.
That was the phraseology, the ghettoization of African studies. What people saw as being untrammeled scholarship, or being sort of some pure scholarship, to which they were losing. And so they hoisted the banner of purity and hoisted the banner of a certain kind of what almost, it's sort of like a religious experience, or almost a cathartic, if we lose this, then we have nothing.
Right.
And what's really, what folks are really saying, if you peel back the layer, is that they're losing the ability to weaponize, the method and the byproduct of professional history. And they're also losing the ability to shape consciousness in the way that expertise that came from that weaponization used to have a hold. Now, the Africans that used to be the subject of the history, they are writing, and they're now the agents of that history. right? So it's really a cry and sort of a plea of losing. Folks are losing ground, losing that terrain, and what happens is fear. And he said it, you know, I fear. But when I'm saying that,
That's
that
right.
fear is not hyperbole.
That's right.
It's not metaphor. It's a real fear. It's a fear that you're losing the capacity and ability, much like Phil Curtin's I think it was 89 in the Chronicle of Higher Ed.
It says here it was 95.
95. Okay.
But
My
it's the
apologies.
same
Yeah.
thing. And that's why, you know, to Frum's credit, I got to give him credit for pulling this up because he's similarly making our point that obviously he's not saying it this way, but he's saying, you know, like these white male scholars keep making the same argument. They keep complaining. So Philip Curtin was saying the same thing in the mid 90s, quoted here saying, I am troubled by increasing evidence. So to your point, I have fear. I am troubled by increasing evidence of the use of racial criteria in filing faculty posts in the field of African history. This form of intellectual apartheid, he called it, has been around for several decades, but it appears to have become much more serious in the past few years to the extent that white scholars trained in African history now have a hard time finding jobs. Oh, Lordy, Lord.
Yep.
The field, we created this field. We called it African because we're studying you. We didn't mean to include you. And now you're taking our jobs and wanting to do, to your point, as you were just saying, you want to do the work, you want to study. And I am troubled. Right. I am troubled.
And there's a classic, you know, dog whistle, because the fact is this: the numerical majority. I think the last time I checked the stats, there are over 3,600 accredited college universities in this country, and 80 to 85% of faculty are white and male. In African studies, the same number.
Say that again. Wait. I'm sorry. Say that. Run those numbers real quick.
Sure.
One more time.
Last I checked, I could be off a little bit, but I think this still holds true, that there are just over 3,600 accredited college universities in the country. The vast majority of faculty, particularly tenured faculty, 85% are white and male. And in African studies, that holds true. Now, there have been more white women, so their numbers have gone up. But demographically speaking, and especially in the historical profession, it is predominantly white and male. So
I used to listen to the podcast from the African Historical Society. I think it's their podcast I used to listen to, and you could go weeks without hearing an African person talk. Like it was hosted by whites. A lot of the scholars that they were interviewing were European. And even where there was some fascinating and interesting research being done, it was hard not to notice. It's like, wow, it's a lot of non-Africans. It's not a lot of Africans studying Africans, at least not being invited to these platforms.
Certainly. And you know, in a sense, you know, it's not, I want to make clear, it's not because folks studying Africa because they're white. Right. But it is because expertise is linked to the fact that they're white. So, for example, when I've done archival research and field research in West Africa, Ghana in particular, but also neighboring countries, I see people, African folks, bend over backwards, you know, for these white scholars in the archive. In some cases, and maybe this is the benefit of my assimilation of sorts. It's rare that anyone would ever, you know, think that I was a professor, or B, that I had a PhD. But I've seen people bend over backwards, right, for these white folks. And so I know on the ground, and I've been a number of places, whether it's archives in Brazil, or I'm working even in Jamaica, or I'm working in West Africa, or I'm working certainly other parts. You know, there's a way in which there's an assumption that to be white means that you can be an expert about anything, anywhere, and anyone. And that's what I'm saying here. So I want to be very clear to folks who will check this out, that is not because that they're phenotypically or categorically in terms of U.S. racial categories white, but because of the very intimate links with being expert in something that vast majority of them are not expert in African languages. But there's an assumption that there are experts in what they write, in what they produce, and therefore they get this unquestioned pass. And that's what I mean by, the demography and the fear, the boogeyman being thrown up that we're losing jobs. Really, no. You check the stats. The stats are what they are. In fact, in the field of history, and these are AHA numbers, because I'm a member of the organization, who are not in history from grad students and therefore in the pipeline are students of African ancestry. This is a Eurasian profession, period. Over 90% Eurasian.
Again, from its imperial origins, I guess we shouldn't be surprised, but even maybe even in the response from some of these academics, and to your point, look, I feel among my more politically soft, moments is in this area where again, principally, philosophically, or whatever, broadly speaking, I want everybody to be able to study whatever. I think the more study, the better. So I don't have any particular opposition to whites per se studying African history or any other part of the world. But as I understand your point, the issue is when they get to determine what the standards are, what the profession does, who gets what access, whose interpretations are considered valid, and to your point, the impact on how the world views who can be a legitimate scholar and who cannot, simply based on phenotype. It becomes a problem. So yeah, listen, were there any other parts of this article that you wanted to make sure we got to, or any other points that you wanted to make sure we addressed from this issue that I haven't invited you to? I just want, in terms of just checking time and where
Sure.
we are with covering it all. Yeah.
I think we touched on the sort of major ones. Maybe the last one is that proverbial from that MLK book, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Community chaos.
Right.
It's sort of where we go from here, because even though it may be maybe sort of a literary license to create sort of a cliffhanger, leave people out there. I do think it would be helpful in terms of winding down to at least poke at sort of where do we go from here, because there's a lot still to be produced, and I don't think, even as someone that does history, I don't think that writing is the only or most important way to present history.
Yeah, I did need to ask you what you thought about that point, like in terms of the what they're saying, what the concern about the singled authored manuscript, or
I have a major problem with that, because to me that is a very imperial and colonial edifice, but it circles back to my point about expertise. So there are two things that I found about telling the stories of people of African ancestry worldwide, right? One is that Africans can't be hero in their own stories. And I dare you, and I feel like I double dare you and the folks who will check this out, to find a piece of literature or movie where the African was the hero in their own story. It's hard, isn't it?
And even when they do movies about real Africans and give awards to Forrest Whitaker, for instance, they have to create fake European journalists to make the protest. Like they it's like, damn.
I'm telling you, bro. I realized that maybe a few years ago. I was doing something. I was like, Africans can't be heroes in their own stories. And the second adjunct is that unless they have a white aid, ally, or protagonist, which makes it not their story.
That's it.
So that to me is really what's at stake. And so at any point, you find, and I remember, you can check it out too. One late night host, it could be Jimmy Fallon, it could be somebody else, they were chatting maybe a year or two ago to Eddie Murphy when Coming to America 2 came out, and they were talking to Eddie Murphy about the production of it, and say, hey, you sort of had an almost all black cast, right? And Eddie Murphy told a backstory that, in fact, he and Arsenio told a story that, in their vision, in their mind, it was going to be all African cast, right? But they were told in order to make the movie, they had to have a white actor.
Now, the way I remember that story is that was in reference. So maybe I don't remember the way I remember that story was in reference to the first one, and that's why the fat white dude Louis Anderson was
exactly
in that.
right. Exactly.
Right.
Precisely.
They told him they were like, you can't have. You're right. They said you got to have somebody white in there.
Exactly. Precisely. We're on the same page. We're on the same page, man. We're on the same page. Exactly. And that's the arc of my argument that I'm making here. That the single authorship reproduces that, because most Africanists are not fluent or experts in African languages, which means they're not fluent in African cultures, because the culture is baked in the language. And I'm sure you know this from people who are multilingual, is that you have to, and not just studying dictionaries or lexicons, by the way. I mean, on the ground, right? In fact, white scholars prefer to have an interpreter and a research assistant, which is code, by the way, right? Which is to say that those people who know the language and culture and know the landscape and ecologies, they are reduced to research assistants. And therefore, which means that they are removed from the category of being experts, because they're the real experts, right? On the ground. And a single authorship preserves that. In fact, I was pushing back against that some years ago, to say that, why is it one person when, I relied on all these healers that I interviewed for in my dissertation. And the reason I interviewed them, because they're the experts, right? Now, I'm the medium for conveying and interpreting their ideas, but they're the experts, right? And that's the position I take, which we can talk about more probably when we talk about the book. But that's for me, again, is the underbelly historical profession, is that it maintains and it defends the single authorship, which means it defends white expertise.
I also remember Dr. Turner encouraging us to work in groups and saying that more of Africana scholarship should be produced in groups. That it would help improve the work and build solidarity, all kinds of stuff. So I that was my first thought when I read that line. I was like, and really what you're saying is you don't want people to be able to produce, to use other talents or cultural conveying mechanisms to produce what's considered scholarship, because particularly for European academics, the encouragement at least is to single author writing. And so anybody that might produce something that's a little bit outside of that, it allows for the interpreter to become the expert, and they don't want that. They're like, nah, you still need me to write it in the way, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And in fact, there's a recent book, and maybe we can wrap up this way. It's not a history, but it's by an anthropologist, Richard Price, and produced a lot of work on Suriname, the Maroons in Suriname. He and his wife, Sally. But he had a recent book called Travels with Toy, which is about his encounter with this healer in French Guiana named Toy, T-O-O-Y. And much of the materials come from Toy's visions, his recollection, his stories about his deep ancestry from the 18th century, right? And Price collects and interprets these stories, but he said that the reason, Price says, intro to his book, is that the reason why this is not a dual authored book is because I'm the anthropologist and he's the Obia man. These are his words. Yeah, you read it. It's called Travel the Toy. I'm the anthropologist and he's the Obia man, right? Now
that's funny, because I was introduced to Obia man, admittedly, through reading about Bob Marley, and from the context of his form of Jamaican Africanism, or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
That's a very important. That's not a reducible That's not some sideline, you know what I mean? Like to be below the
Right.
scholar.
But check this out. It is Toy. He's the expert. He's the one that giving him these stories about ancestors for which, you know, Price would never know and can't never ever know, because he doesn't have that particular skill in mediumship, and doesn't know that he has the language or the connection or the ritual force and skill, right, or acumen. This is, in other words, that book is only possible through Toy.
That's right.
But Price says it. I'm the anthropologist. He's the opium.
Listen,
so the stuff about the about power, expertise, and the like is much deeper than people have, I think, expected or even thought would be there. But this stuff runs deep, and these are just, I'm just scratching the surface with you, man.
Sure. No, I know. And that's why we're going to have you back again and again and again and again. I want, obviously want you to consider this a home for you. So anytime, and like you just did with this one, I really appreciate, I love it when people, particularly like you and others, reach out and say, hey, did you see this? Let's talk about it. So anytime that something like this pops up, please do continue to reach out to me and us over here. Thank you for coming through and leading us through this discussion and reminding folks, as I like to, that not all of us in academia are some ivory scholar towers, whatever, separated from struggle. And then, as the title of this video suggests, these wars continue. Like, these are intellectual and I think connected to imperial struggle wars that are taking place inside the academy, but obviously reverberate outside the academy. So thank you very much for bringing this to my and our attention. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace.
Jared,
you know you're willing to fight.
Jared,
no, I got you. I just go ahead. Come on back. Go ahead.
Before you do that, because I want you to end the way you usually end. By the way, I love the BPM promo commercial of the football.
Shout out to Ear Doctor, man. Yes,
I love it, man. But I wanted to at least circle back and end with Turner.
Oh yeah, perfect. Please.
Turner said this to me, and he might have said it to you too. He says, all political regimes are sponsored and sustained by intellectual regimes.
Thank you for that again, because that's a better way to end it. Rest in power to Dr. Turner. Thank you, Dr. Konadu, for your work and coming through. And as always, as Fred Hampton used to say to you, we say peace, because you are definitely willing to fight for it. Thanks to all those who will see this when it comes out. Please continue to support BPM and all that we produce. Thanks, everybody. Catch you next time here at I Mix What I Like. Peace, everybody. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.